4 Apache brides faced a death sentence. A lone cowboy faced down the whole valley. The rope was already knotted. I could see that from the ridge, even with the afternoon sun flat in my eyes and a quarter-mile of scrub between me and the plaza. 4 of them, young women, Apache by their dress, standing in a line across the porch of what used to be the trading post. Hands bound in front. A man in a black coat reading from a piece of paper. Maybe 40 people gathered in the dust below him, most of them looking at their boots. I sat my horse and I watched. I had been 3 days out of Shenega, riding to nowhere in particular. That was what I'd been doing since I turned in my star at Shenega, which was 6 weeks prior. I had a bedroll, a Winchester, a tin of coffee grounds that were getting thin, and approximately $14 to my name. I was 53 years old, and I had a bad left knee that predicted weather, and a right shoulder that had been improperly set after a thing in Hatch that I didn't like to think about. And I had thought somewhere in the back of my skull that I might just keep riding until the desert took me and saved everybody the trouble. But there was the rope. 4 of them couldn't have been older than 20, any of them. One was a girl who might have been 16. The man in the black coat was still reading. The crowd was still looking at the ground. I pulled my hat down and turned my horse off the ridge. I'll tell you about the valley first, or none of what comes after makes the right kind of sense. The valley was called Calder's Valley by then, not on any official map, but in common usage, which in that country was more binding than paper. A man named Harlan Calder had arrived there about 15 years prior with enough money to buy the large land grants, and enough will to make the purchase of the smaller ones feel like the better option for whoever held them. He had run out 3 small ranching families in the first 2 years. He had consolidated the water rights on the north end. He had put his own man, a former hired gun named Elias Prout, in as sheriff of the county seat, a little town called Morrow, which meant that Prout's jurisdiction was whatever Calder said it was, and his law was whatever served Calder's purposes on a given day. There were Apache families living in the southern end of the valley, had been living there since before anyone now alive could remember. They had a water source, a small creek that came down off the mesa, and enough grazing land to run a modest number of horses and cattle. They had not interfered with Calder's operation. They had, by every account I later gathered, kept entirely to themselves. Calder wanted that southern end. The water was part of it. The creek fed into a larger channel, and there were plans, I heard later, for a canal project that needed control of the headwaters. But it was also simply land, and land was what Calder collected the way some men collect grievances. He'd been working on it for 2 years by the time I came over that ridge, moving fences onto the boundary, diverting a tributary, burning a camp once and calling it a grass fire, and the family at the center of it, the family who'd refused to move, who'd refused to sell at the price offered, who'd refused to be frightened into going, was headed by a man named Kuruk, who was some kind of headman among his people, and who had the stubbornness of a man who knew he was right. What Calder could not do was move on Kuruk directly. Not now, because 2 months prior, Kuruk had gone to the territorial court in Albuquerque and filed a formal complaint documenting the fence moving, the water diversion, the fire. He'd done it with the help of a missionary who spoke both languages and knew how to write a legal document, and the complaint had been accepted and was sitting on a judge's desk. Calder couldn't touch Kuruk while that complaint was open, couldn't make him disappear, couldn't run him off, couldn't buy him out with a judge already holding paperwork. So Calder had touched what Kuruk loved. The charge on the paper the black-coated man was reading was theft of cattle. 4 head of Calder stock, allegedly found in the Apache camp 17 days prior. The sentence already determined, already signed before the reading itself just ceremony, was death by hanging. For cattle theft. 4 young women. I had ridden 30 years as a lawman in 4 territories, and I had seen things I do not describe to anyone anymore. and I had never once seen a cattle theft hanging in my life that was actually about cattle. I came down the main street at a walk, kept my hands where they could be seen, didn't hurry, didn't slow down. A man stepped out of the crowd to block me before I got halfway to the porch. Deputy's badge, big through the chest, hand already near his gun. He had the look of a man who'd been paid to stop things and hadn't been told what to do if the thing didn't stop. "Road's closed," he said. "I can see it's open," I said. "I just rode down it." "Legal proceeding, move along." "Where's the judge?" He blinked, "Move along." "I'll ask it again slower. A hanging requires a judge, a record of trial, evidence submitted under oath, and a jury or a bench finding. Where is the judge?" He put his hand on his gun. "Last chance." I looked past him at the porch. The man in the black coat had stopped reading. The whole plaza had gone quiet in that particular way. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a held breath. 40 people trying to figure out what was happening, and whether it gave them permission to feel something different about the day. "I'm going to ride to that porch," I said to the deputy, "and I'm going to ask some questions. You can shoot me in the back while I do it, or you can step aside. Those are the choices in front of you." He didn't move. I rode around him. The man in the black coat was a territorial attorney named Swick. I found that out later. He had the smooth, closed face of a man who'd been hired to feel nothing about the work he was doing, and he'd gotten good at it. "This proceeding is legally constituted under." "Where's the evidence?" I said. I stopped my horse at the porch steps and stayed in the saddle, which put me level with him. "The 4 head of cattle that were stolen, where are they right now?" "The evidence was presented before the—" "To who? A jury, a judge?" "I'd like to see the trial record." "The sentence was handed down by—" "Handed down by Harlan Calder," I said, not loud, just clear. "Which means it wasn't handed down by anyone with the legal authority to hang a fence post. Whatever piece of paper you're holding isn't a death warrant unless it came out of a territorial court. Did it come out of a territorial court?" Swick's mouth worked, and nothing came out of it. I could see Prout now, coming around the side of the building. Heavy man, slow-moving, the kind of slow that comes from knowing you've never had to hurry because the trouble always waited for you. 2 men behind him, both with rifles. "Off the horse," Prout said. "Give me a minute." I looked at the 4 women on the porch. Up close they were all young. 3 of them watching me with the steady, taking everything in attention that I'd come to respect in 30 years of working, alongside various peoples the government had been treating badly. The youngest one, the girl of 16 or so, was looking at her bound hands. "You speak English?" I said. The one nearest me raised her eyes. She had a cut on her lip, 2 or 3 days old from a blow rather than a fall. The shape of it said so. Direct eyes. Composed in a way that told me she'd had to become composed recently, in the last few days, because composure was what was keeping her together. "Yes," she said. "Did you steal cattle?" Something moved in her face. Not quite surprise. More like someone had asked her the question she'd expected to remain permanently unasked. "No." "Were you in camp the night the cattle allegedly went missing?" "All of us were, all night." She glanced at her sisters. "That's what they were, I could see that now. We were at the fire until it went to coals. An old woman at the south well saw us." "She's Apache." "No, she is Mexican. She has lived at the south well for 30 years. I turned back to Prout. He was 6 feet away, hand on his gun, 2 riflemen behind him. "You have a witness," I said, "who can place these women at their family's camp the entire night the cattle allegedly disappeared. A non-Apache witness with no stake in the outcome. Why wasn't she called?" Prout's jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle in it. "Off the horse, now." In a moment, I looked at the crowd, 40 people. Most of them still looking at the ground, but not all of them. There were faces turned up now, some of them wanting to see what happened, some of them wanting something to happen, different kinds of wanting but present just the same. "My name is Callum Dre," I said, loud enough to carry to the edges of the crowd. "I served as a United States Marshal in Dona Ana County for 11 years. Before that, Deputy Marshal in Hatch for 6 years, and before that, various law posts in West Texas starting in 1851. There are men in this valley who have heard my name, and men who have ridden with me, and men who have gone to jail because of me. And if you hang these 4 women today, every one of them will know it happened in front of me, and I didn't stop it. And when the territorial investigation into Kuruk's complaint comes into this valley, which it will, because the complaint is already filed and the process is already in motion, the first thing they're going to want to know is what happened to his daughters while he was in Albuquerque seeking legal remedy." I looked at Swick. "You're a licensed territorial attorney. Whatever Calder paid you, it isn't worth your license, and they will pull your license for this. There is no reading of the territorial code in which what's happening on this porch today was legally constituted." Swick had gone pale, the kind of pale that happens when a man realizes the arithmetic he'd been doing was wrong. "Cut them loose," I said. "We'll call today an administrative error, and no one needs to put it in a report." The long minute after that was the kind of minute that feels like it has more time in it than a minute ought to have. I could hear the horse I'd come in on shifting its weight behind me. I could hear the boards of the porch under the women's feet. I could hear my own breathing, and I tried to keep it even, which wasn't hard. I'd made my accounting on the ridge, and the accounting was done. There was nothing left to be afraid of. Prut looked at me, then at the crowd, then at Swick. Swick folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. Prut turned to one of his men and jerked his chin toward the women. The man went up the porch steps with a knife and cut the rope at their wrists. Did it without looking at them. The 4 of them stood there for a moment, rubbing their wrists, and then the youngest one, the girl of 16, sat down on the porch steps because her legs had stopped holding her, and the one nearest to me put a hand on her shoulder. The crowd broke apart. That's what a crowd does when the air goes out of a moment. They break apart in 1s and 2s and don't look at each other because they know they were all there, and they'd all rather not acknowledge what they were there for. Prut walked back around the side of the building. His men followed. Swick went to his horse, which was tied at the rail, and rode north without looking back. I got down from my horse. The woman who'd spoken to me came down the porch steps. Up close in the full light, she was taller than I'd thought, maybe 22, 23. The composure she'd been holding was still there, but it was different now, looser, like a rope taken off a post, the shape of the tautness remaining even after the tension was gone. She stopped in front of me and looked at me for a moment. "Why?" she said. It wasn't an accusation or a challenge. She genuinely wanted to know. I thought about it. I had been thinking about it since I turned off the ridge, actually, and I still didn't have a clean answer. "I used to have a job," I said finally, "keeping things from going wrong. I handed the job in 6 weeks ago. Apparently I didn't hand in the habit." She looked at me a moment longer. Then she said, "Our father is in Albuquerque." "I know. He should stay there until the territorial response to his complaint comes back. Coming back into the valley before then gives Calder more exposure, not less." She nodded slowly, working through it. "How long?" "Hard to say. Could be 3 weeks, could be 2 months. Depends on the judge's calendar and how backed up the court is." "Calder will try again." "Yes, but not this exact thing again. The rope was a gamble and it didn't pay. He'll find another angle." I looked at her directly. "Which means your family needs to be careful about what it does and doesn't do in the next few months. Nothing he can twist into a legal charge, nothing that puts any of you alone and away from witnesses." She was quiet, taking that in. "Then, where are you going?" "I don't have a destination," I said. "Not currently." She looked at me once more, the same measuring look, but measuring different things than before. Then she said, "There is a camp at the Red Rocks 2 miles south. You can water your horse there. We'll give you food. I stood at the end of the main street for a while after they walked south. 10 minutes maybe. I rolled a cigarette I didn't light and I thought about continuing west, or north, or any direction that was away from this valley and whatever came next in it. I was good at moving on. I had been practicing it for 30 years under the cover of doing a job, and for the last 6 weeks without the cover. But there was the rope, knotted, and the porch, and the woman who'd told me her father was in Albuquerque and then asked where I was going. I went south. The camp at the Red Rocks was exactly what it was, a family camp. 4 structures built for function rather than impression, a cook fire with a clay pot on it, a small corral with 7 horses that were in better condition than anything Calder's men had been riding. An older woman, grandmother, I thought, by the way the children moved around her, who glanced at me once and then went back to her work. 3 children who stopped what they were doing entirely and stared at me with the unself-conscious inspection of children who haven't learned yet to pretend they aren't looking. One of the sisters showed me the water trough and didn't watch while I tended my horse, which was courtesy. The grandmother brought me food while I was still at the trough, dried meat, flat bread, something in a clay bowl that turned out to be dried berries ground with something, tart and good. She set it on a flat rock near me and walked back to the fire without speaking. I ate standing up, watching the horses. Saya came and sat on a rock near the fire while the light was going. That was her name, Saya. She told me later that her Apache name had several parts and that I would mispronounce them, and that she had decided years ago that being mispronounced was worse than a different name, and so Saya was what she used with people who'd use it wrong otherwise. I sat on the other side of the fire and drank the coffee they offered me, real coffee, better than mine, and she told me the 2 years of it. Plainly in order. The fences moved first and her father's conversation with the man Calder sent, and how that conversation had ended. Then the water, which had taken 2 months to understand because the diversion was subtle, and they'd thought at first it was the dry season, not a man with a shovel working at night. Then the fire, which had taken their main store of winter goods and 2 horses, and which Calder's men had stood and watched with their arms crossed and called an unfortunate accident, and her father's decision, after the fire, to go to Albuquerque. She told it the way people tell things they've already survived, the facts available, the feeling compressed down to something smaller and harder than the original thing. I listened. I am, at bottom, a man who listens. That was most of what law work was, and I'd gotten good at it. At some point the fire burned lower and one of the children, a boy, maybe 8, with a serious face that was going to be a problem for girls in about 10 years, fell asleep against my leg. I didn't move. Eventually the grandmother came and lifted him without ceremony and carried him to one of the structures. "You should sleep," Saya said. "There's room." I wasn't planning to stay. "I know," she looked at the coals, "but you haven't left." I hadn't. I sat there for a while longer after that, smoking a cigarette down to nothing, and then I rolled out my bedroll in the lee of the largest structure where the ground was dry. I slept better than I had in 6 weeks. In the morning I fixed a section of the corral fence that had a bad post. Nobody asked me to. The post was bad and I had the time and the tools were there, so I fixed it. Saya's younger sister, second eldest, name of Dolly, brought me coffee and watched me work with the frank curiosity of someone who hasn't decided yet whether to trust you and is collecting data. "You were really a marshal," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "For a while." "Why did you stop?" "I set the post and tamped the dirt around it. Got tired of it being a politics job instead of a law job." She thought about that. "What's the difference?" "A law job, you do what the law says regardless of who it helps or hurts on a given day. A politics job, you do what helps the people who hired you and you call it law." I tested the post. It held. Shenega had gone political. I handed in my star. She was quiet a moment. Then, Prute's job has always been political. Yes, I said, it has. I stayed another day, then another. There was the corral, and then there was a water channel on the south side of the camp that had silted up and was draining wrong, and then there was a roof section that needed new poles, and I am constitutionally incapable of leaving a thing half done. Saya didn't say anything about it. She worked alongside me on the channel. She knew the land better than I did and directed where the cut needed to go, and she brought me food and coffee, and in the evenings we sat by the fire and she told me more of the valley, its history, the families in it, the men who'd bent to Calder and the ones who hadn't and what had happened to each type. I told her some things too, not everything but some things. On the fourth day, I was still there when Calder's men came back. Not Prute this time. Calder himself, in the late afternoon when the sun comes flat from the west and you can't see into it well. He had 6 riders with him, all of them armed. I was near the trough when I heard them, and I stood up and moved to where I could see the entrance to the camp and where they could see me. Saya came out of the main structure with a rifle she carried easy, not pointed at anything, just carried. Calder was about 60, well-fed without being soft, the way men who work hard at making money get, not the softness of ease but the density of someone who's been converting other people's effort into his own substance for a long time. White shirt, hat that cost money, eyes that were calculating and not stupid. He looked at me for a moment. Dre. Calder. He hadn't expected me to still be here. I could see that. I hadn't been sure I'd still be here either, to be honest, but I was, and here we were. This isn't your fight, he said. I've been here 4 days, I said. I'd say it is now. He looked at Saya, then back at me. He was doing the arithmetic, the same arithmetic Prute had done, but more carefully, because he was smarter than Prute and understood more of the variables. The territorial complaint, he said, whatever comes back from Albuquerque will come back in Kuruk's favor, I said. You know that. The land claims are valid, the diversion was illegal, and the fire is going to be a problem for you because 2 of your men were seen watching it. If you'd had a legal case against any of this, you'd have used it instead of the rope. I looked at his riders. They were good, experienced, disciplined, not nervous. Calder hired well. Going through me to get to this camp starts a different kind of trouble for you, the kind that doesn't stay local. You're a retired lawman with no jurisdiction. I'm a retired lawman with a reputation and a lot of former colleagues in the territory who would like nothing better than a reason to look into your operation. I let that sit. What do you want here, Calder? Not what do you want this afternoon. What do you actually want? He looked at me. He was weighing something, I could see it happening. A man of 60 who's built what he's built has to weigh things that cost him. The land, he said, I'll buy it, fair market value, which is more than it's worth. That's not my decision to make. He looked at Saya. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was even and clear, my father makes that decision when he comes back. And if he comes back and says no, then it's no. Calder sat his horse, 6 armed men behind him, a woman with a rifle in front of him and a retired marshal with no badge but a name he knew. The afternoon light was still bad, coming flat from the west, and none of his riders could see into it well. He turned his horse and rode north. The days after that were quieter. Prute sent 2 men past the camp twice in the following week, slow rides along the track that ran by the red rocks, making their presence known. I let them see me. That was the point of them seeing me, I think, and I accommodated it. On the second pass, one of them called out something that was meant to be intimidating and I didn't answer, and they rode on. On the third pass they didn't bother. Whatever Prute had hoped to learn from having them go past, he'd gotten it, which was that I was still there and not inclined to be moved by slow rides. I sent a letter north. I had a former deputy, a man named Rios, who'd gone to work for the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe after our time together in Dona Ana, and I wrote him a plain account of what had happened on the porch and asked him to make sure the right people knew the name Elias Prout and the name Harlan Calder and the county they operated in. Not to act on anything, just to know. To have it on a desk somewhere. I'd learned in 30 years that having something on a desk somewhere is often the difference between a situation that can be corrected and one that can't. Rios wrote back in 3 weeks. He had, in fact, already heard the name Calder in a context that made him interested. He didn't say more than that in a letter, but I understood him. Rios had always been a man who understood what a thing meant without being told all of it. Word was moving around the valley. That's what happens when something like the porch happens in a small place. It moves around. It changes shape slightly each time it moves. It picks up details it didn't have and loses details it did, and becomes part of what the valley knows about itself. I heard some of what was being said secondhand, from the older woman at the south well. Her name was Senora Vargas, and she had lived at that well since before Calder arrived and fully intended to outlive him. Who came to the camp once to check on Saya and her sisters, and who spoke excellent English and had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She was a small woman with a spine like a fence post, and she looked at me for a long time when Saya introduced us, the way you look at a horse you're considering buying, and then she nodded once and that seemed to settle it. According to Senora Vargas, the version of events that had settled in Morrow was that Dre had ridden in from nowhere and called Prout's bluff and Prout had backed down, which was accurate enough. What she didn't say, but what I heard in how she said it, was that there were people in the valley who had been waiting for something to back Prout down, and who were now doing their own quiet kind of arithmetic about what the valley could look like if it had a different kind of law in it. I fixed the roof section. The new poles were the right diameter, and the lashing held the first time, which was satisfying. I am easily satisfied by things that hold. Saya watched me work on the roof from below and once or twice said something precise about where a pole needed to go that turned out to be right. She had that kind of eye, spatial, immediate. She didn't explain how she knew, she just said it, and I learned to not ignore it. In the evenings, we talked more than we had in the first days. She asked me about Hatch, about the thing that had put my shoulder wrong, and I told her the shape of it without all the detail. She asked me about my family, a wife, once, early in my law career, gone to fever before we'd had a year. I told her that too. She didn't say she was sorry, she nodded, which was better. She told me about a man she'd been engaged to at 20, from another family, who had died of something in his chest in the winter before last. She told it plainly, not looking for comfort, just accounting for the shape of her situation honestly, the way she told everything. I listened and didn't say I was sorry either. The symmetry of that sat right with both of us. Kuruk came back in the 3rd week of September. He was riding a roan horse and sitting it the way a man sits a horse when he's been vindicated. Not triumphant, Kuruk wasn't that kind of man, but settled. Something resolved in the set of his shoulders. Saya had sent word to him about the porch and about me through a rider 2 days after the event, so he knew the general shape of things when he arrived. He came into camp, saw me standing near the corral, and came directly over. He shook my hand, held it a moment. He was about 55, lean, with a face that had been weathered by 40 years of looking into the same wind that had been trying to blow him away from this land. His English was deliberate and correct in the way of someone who'd learned it for a specific purpose and used it without false comfort. "My daughters told me what you did," he said. "They were going to hang your daughters for cattle theft with no trial and no evidence," I said. "I couldn't let that happen." "But you didn't have to stop it." "No." He held my hand a moment longer and looked at me, and I understood from that look, the long, taking-in look, that he was acknowledging something without saying it, which was his way. Then he let go and went to his daughters, and I gave them the rest of that afternoon to themselves. The territorial finding was formal and in writing. Kuruk's land claims were valid. The water diversion was a civil violation subject to remedy. The fire was flagged for investigation as a possible criminal act. Calder had 45 days to remove his fences from the boundary line. Kuruk read the document twice, slowly, at the fire that evening. He didn't say anything while he read it. When he was done, he folded it along its original creases and set it in his coat. Then he looked at me across the fire and nodded once. I nodded back. It wasn't a small thing, what that piece of paper said. It was not common, in that territory in that time, for a piece of paper with a government seal on it to say the right thing about land that Apache people had held for generations. I don't want to make it sound simpler than it was or more permanent than it proved to be over the long years after. But for this valley, on this piece of ground, it said the right thing. And Kuruk had gone 3 days' ride to make it say it, at 60 years old, through a system that had been built to say the other thing, and it had said it. Calder's attorney in Morrow filed an appeal. The appeal was heard in November and denied in December. In January, Calder's fences came off the boundary line. I watched 2 of his men do the work from the ridge, the same ridge where I'd first seen the rope. Different view from up there, going the other direction. I was still in the valley in January. That's not something I'd planned. I hadn't planned anything past the ridge. There was work to do was the honest reason, and it's true that there was work. The winter preparations. The supply run to the trading post in Morrow that required a careful kind of presence because Prout was still the sheriff until he wasn't. A fence line on the eastern edge that needed 4 new posts and 60 yards of wire. But the honest truth inside the honest reason was that I didn't want to leave, and I hadn't wanted to leave since about the 5th day, and I'd been finding work to justify not leaving since then. Saya knew it. She didn't say so, but she knew it. She has a way of knowing things without making you say them. There was an evening in late October, cold and clear. The sky hard blue and the stars coming out early. We were bringing in wood from the pile before dark, stacking it inside the large structure against the west wall. She handed me a piece of wood, and I took it, and her hands and mine were both around it for a moment, and she looked at me. Not the measuring look from the first day, not the listening look from the evenings by the fire. A different kind of looking, the kind that comes after you've made a decision, and you're checking to make sure it's right. I held her gaze. Neither of us said anything. She took her hands off the wood and I stacked it on the pile and we finished bringing in the wood and that was all, but it wasn't nothing. Kuruk came to me in November. Not directly. He was not a direct man in the way that word usually means. He came to where I was working on the east fence line and helped me for 2 hours without talking about anything other than the fence, where the wire was right, where it needed adjustment, the ground. Then, when we were walking back in the late afternoon, he said, "You were going somewhere when you came over the ridge." "Nowhere in particular," I said. "You are still not going there." "That's right." He walked for a while. "My daughter is a careful woman. She has had reason to become careful." "I know. She is not careful about you." I didn't say anything to that. "I don't know what your intentions are," Kuruk said. "I stay when I should stay," I said. "I don't leave when I shouldn't leave. That's as far as my intentions go most of the time." He thought about that. Then he nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The way he acknowledged things, taking them in and letting them sit. He never asked me directly. He simply, over the following months, began to include me in the conversations he had with men he trusted, the real conversations, about the valley and the land and what was being planned and what ought to be done. The ones where he said what he actually thought and expected the same back. It was a form of inclusion that meant more than being asked to dinner, and I understood that. Calder made one more attempt in February. A different attorney, a different paper, this one claiming that the east fence line, the one I had rerun with new posts, encroached on an existing Calder boundary easement. It was creative. It wasn't true, and the survey record made it not true in a way that was easy to demonstrate. But it was the kind of thing that could slow down a year and cost a man money in legal fees he might not have. I went tomorrow and sat in the new sheriff's office. Pruitt had been transferred east in December, replaced by a young man from Las Cruces named Garza who was fresh enough to still believe in the job, and explained the survey history and the document trail. And Garza listened and made notes, and sent a letter to Calder's attorney explaining why the claim had no basis in the county record. Calder dropped the claim. I heard 6 months after that he'd sold his North holding and moved his main operation east, toward the Pecos. Don't know if it was because of us specifically, or because the territorial court had put too much attention on how he'd been operating in the valley. Either way, he went. I need to tell you about a morning in March. It was mud season, that particular kind of late winter mud that gets into everything, that's cold and dark, that's everywhere at once. I was splitting wood behind the main structure. Just splitting wood, the simple work of it, the weight of the axe and the crack of the wood and the cold air on my face. Saya came around the corner. She stood and watched me split 2 pieces without saying anything. The families at the south end of the valley, she said. 3 or 4 of them. They've been hearing what happened here. About the porch, about Calder, about the fence. I split another piece. They're thinking that what you did, standing up in that plaza, that maybe someone would do the same for them. Some of them have been waiting a long time for the kind of law you're describing to Garza. I'm not a marshal, I said. I know what you are. I looked at her. She walked to me. She took the axe out of my hand and set it against the woodpile, not dramatically, just set it there, and then she put both her hands flat on my chest, the way you'd put a hand on a stone wall to test if it was solid. Not holding, not reaching, feeling. She held her hands there and looked at me. I know what you are, she said again. I put my arms around her. We stood in the mud, in the cold, in the early spring, ugly nothing of it, and I could feel her breathing and she could feel mine, and there was nothing grand about it. A woman and a man in the mud in March, her hands on my chest, finding that I was still there. I was still there. The woodpile was half done. We went back to it after a while. She handed me pieces and I split them and we stacked them against the wall. I want to tell you one more thing and then I'm done. Summer came. The valley was different by summer. The water channel ran right, the corral was solid, the east fence held through spring. Garza came out to the camp twice with questions about the survey, legitimate questions, and Kuruk answered them. And I answered them, and we all 3 sat and had coffee, which was something I would not have imagined on the day I came over the ridge. Garza was 29 and careful, the kind of careful that comes from understanding you're operating in a place that has been run wrong for a long time, and that wrong habits are hard to break, and that making enemies quickly doesn't serve the law any more than Pruitt's way had. I respected him for that patience. Some men his age would have wanted to make a show. He didn't. The Calder men who'd been on Pruitt's roster, there were 4 or 5 of them who'd made their living from Pruitt's version of the job. Some of them left when Pruitt left, and some of them stayed and tried to make themselves useful to Garza, which Garza handled with a care that impressed me. He kept 2 of them on as temporary deputies, which gave them a reason to stay legitimate, and made it clear to both of them what legitimate meant under his watch. I thought that was well done. There was a man named Delgado at the south end who had a land problem of the kind I now knew how to recognize. Not a Calder problem. Calder was gone, but a local thing. A county clerk who'd been misrecording boundaries for years in ways that always seemed to favor the same family. The Delgados had been trying to address it through the county for 3 years, and getting nowhere because the man they needed to complain to was related to the clerk by marriage. I went tomorrow and spent 2 days in the records office and pulled together what I found and brought it to Garza, who had no such relation to the clerk and no particular patience for what he found in the record when he looked. The clerk was gone by October. The Delgado boundary got corrected in November. I did that because Saya had told me the families at the south end were watching and waiting. I did it because Garza was a good man doing a real job, and he needed someone to bring him things he could act on. I did it because I was in the valley and the valley needed it. Not because I had a badge. Because I was there. I carried the memory of that porch through all of it. Not in a heavy way. I'm not a man who carries things heavily if I can help it, and I've had to learn to put things down or they'll break you. But I carried it the way you carry a compass. The rope, already knotted. The women in a line. The crowd looking at their boots. The particular silence of 40 people who know something is wrong and are waiting for someone else to say so first. Somebody had to say it first. I had said it first before in other places, other plazas, other moments exactly like that one. But I'd been a marshal then, with a badge and a government behind me, and it was easier to speak when the government is backing your voice. This time I had had nothing but a name and a horse and the habit. And it had worked the same. That's the thing nobody tells you about authority, about the real kind. It doesn't come from the badge. It comes from the willingness, from turning your horse off the ridge and riding down. The badge is just the paperwork. The authority is what you carry when the paperwork's gone. I'm 53 years old and I have a bad knee and a shoulder that's been wrong since hatch, and I have a reputation that is either an asset or a liability, depending on who you're talking to. I handed in my star because the job had become something I didn't recognize anymore. It had become about keeping the peace for whoever had the most to lose from the peace being disturbed, which wasn't the same as keeping order, which wasn't the same as the law. I had known this was happening for years, and I had stayed anyway because I was good at the job, and because there is a comfort in knowing exactly what you're supposed to do every morning, even if the thing you're supposed to do is fraying at the edges. And then one morning it frayed past the point I could hold on to it, and I walked into the office, and I put my star on the desk and I walked out. I rode out of Shenega with $14 and no plan. I came over a ridge and saw a rope, already knotted. I turned my horse around. I think about that turn sometimes, the simplicity of it, not a decision made with all the factors weighed, not a calculation about what I could or couldn't accomplish, just the turn. My horse's nose swinging south, the ridge behind me. On the porch after Prout backed down and the crowd broke apart, the woman who would become Saya to me asked why I'd done it. And I said, I used to have a job and I didn't hand in the habit, which was true, but there's something under that I didn't say because I didn't have words for it then. What I know now is this. There is a particular feeling a man gets when the thing in front of him is wrong in a way that's very clear, and he has it in his power to say so plainly and nobody else is saying it. It's not bravery. It's more like a pressure, like a hand pushing you from behind, not toward anything in particular, just forward. I went forward. I came down that ridge. And in the mud in March in the cold, a woman put her hands flat on my chest and felt that I was solid, still there. And she was right. I was. The woodpile got done before dark. We ate by the fire, all of us, Saya and her sisters and her father and the children. The boy of 8 with the serious face sitting against me again, which had become a habit neither of us acknowledged. The fire burning down to coals the way fires do. The valley outside, settling into night. It was quiet and it was ours.